In the frozen expanse of Siberia, along a border stretching nearly 5,000 miles, two empires stood face to face throughout the Second World War, each eyeing the other with suspicion, each calculating the cost of invasion, each waiting for the other to make a fatal mistake. On one side, the sprawling Soviet Union, locked in a death struggle with Nazi Germany that would consume 27 million Soviet lives. On the other, Imperial Japan, an ascending power that had already conquered vast swaths of China and was preparing to seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Logic would suggest that Japan, allied with Germany through the Tripartite Pact, would strike the Soviet Union from the east, while Hitler's armies advanced from the west, crushing Stalin's regime between two unstoppable forces. Yet this never happened. Despite years of planning, despite genuine desire, despite repeated German pleas for coordination, Japan never launched a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Far East during World War II. The question is not whether Japan wanted to attack, because it absolutely did, but rather why it ultimately chose a different path, one that would lead not to Vladivostok and Lake Baikal, but to Pearl Harbor and the gates of its own destruction. To understand this decision, we must first recognize that Japanese-Soviet hostility was neither theoretical nor distant. It was visceral, tested in blood, and rooted in decades of territorial competition. The two powers had already fought twice in living memory before the outbreak of World War II, and both conflicts had left deep impressions on Japanese military thinking. The first clash came in 1938 at Lake Khasan, near the junction of the Soviet, Chinese, and Korean borders. Japanese forces, probing Soviet defenses in what they assumed would be a limited border skirmish, found themselves facing a concentrated and well-coordinated Soviet response. Between July and August of 1938, approximately 20,000 Soviet troops, supported by tanks and aircraft, engaged Japanese forces in brutal combat across the hills surrounding the lake. The Soviets suffered significant casualties, nearly 10,000 men killed or wounded, but the Japanese fared worse in strategic terms. They were forced to withdraw, and the incident demonstrated that the Red Army, despite Stalin's ongoing purges of its officer corps, could still mount an effective combined arms operation. But Lake Khasan was merely a prelude. The real test came 1 year later, in the summer of 1939 on the dusty plains of Khalkhin Gol, known to the Japanese as Nomonhan. This was not a skirmish. This was a full-scale battle involving hundreds of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, and it would fundamentally reshape Japanese strategic thinking for the remainder of the war. The conflict began in May 1939 as another border dispute, this time along the frontier between Japanese-controlled Manchukuo and Soviet-aligned Mongolia. The Japanese Kwantung Army, the elite formation responsible for maintaining Japan's colonial grip on Manchuria, believed it could deliver a sharp, localized defeat to Soviet forces and solidify its control over disputed territory. What followed was a masterclass in Soviet operational art, commanded by a then relatively unknown general named Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov arrived at Khalkhin Gol in June 1939 and immediately began preparing not for defense, but for a massive counteroffensive. Throughout the summer, while Japanese forces launched piecemeal attacks, Zhukov secretly concentrated forces far beyond what the Japanese believed possible in such remote terrain. He assembled nearly 60,000 troops, over 500 tanks, and hundreds of aircraft, all supplied through a logistical chain stretching hundreds of miles across the Mongolian steppe. On August 20th, Zhukov struck. Soviet armor, organized into mobile groups that presaged the tank armies of the later war, enveloped Japanese positions in a classic double encirclement. Japanese infantry, trained for close combat, and imbued with fighting spirit but lacking adequate anti-tank weapons and armored support, were systematically destroyed. By mid-September, when a ceasefire was finally arranged, Japanese casualties exceeded 18,000 killed and wounded. Entire units had been annihilated. More importantly, the myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through victories in China, had been shattered against Soviet steel. The psychological impact of Khalkhin Gol on the Japanese military establishment cannot be overstated. The defeat was not merely tactical, but conceptual. It revealed that the Japanese army, for all its discipline and courage, was not prepared for modern mechanized warfare against a peer opponent. The Kwantung Army's doctrine emphasized infantry assault, close combat, and the spiritual superiority of Japanese soldiers. This had worked against poorly equipped Chinese forces, but against Soviet tanks, artillery, and aircraft operating in coordinated mass, it had proven catastrophically inadequate. Senior Japanese officers drew immediate conclusions. General Tojo Hideki, who would later become prime minister, was serving as chief of staff of the Kwantung Army during the Nomonhan incident. He witnessed firsthand the limitations of Japanese military power against the Soviets. The lesson was clear. Any invasion of Soviet territory would require massive preparation, overwhelming force, and most critically, the assurance that the Red Army was already beaten or fully committed elsewhere. This brings us to April 1941, just 2 months before Nazi Germany would launch Operation Barbarossa. In Moscow, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and Japanese Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. On its surface, the agreement was straightforward. Both powers pledged to remain neutral if the other became involved in hostilities with third parties, and both recognized each other's territorial integrity, with the Soviets acknowledging Manchukuo and the Japanese recognizing Soviet influence over Mongolia. For Stalin, the pact was a strategic masterstroke. He was already receiving intelligence reports suggesting a German attack was imminent, and the last thing he needed was a two-front war. Securing Japan's neutrality, even temporarily, would allow him to concentrate forces in the West without fearing a stab in the back from the East. For Japan, the pact provided breathing room to pursue its southern expansion into Southeast Asia without worrying about Soviet interference. But the agreement was never more than a marriage of convenience, and both sides knew it. Japanese military planners continued to develop contingency plans for a northern offensive, and Stalin never fully trusted Japanese intentions, maintaining substantial forces in the Far East throughout the war. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the strategic calculus shifted dramatically. The initial German advance was catastrophic for the Soviets. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the first months. The Baltic states fell within weeks. Leningrad was besieged. Kiev was captured. By October, German forces were within sight of Moscow's spires. To observers in Tokyo, it appeared that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. This was the moment that many Japanese officers had been waiting for. The opportunity to strike the Soviet Far East, while the Red Army was fully committed to stopping the German onslaught. The Kwantung Army, still the most powerful Japanese force in Asia, with over 700,000 men under arms, began preparing for what was called the Kantokuen, or Kwantung Army Special Maneuvers, a plan to seize Soviet territory east of Lake Baikal. The Kantokuen plan was ambitious and detailed. It envisioned a multi-pronged offensive that would seize Vladivostok, capture the Soviet maritime provinces, and potentially drive as far west as Irkutsk, cutting the Trans-Siberian Railway and isolating Soviet forces in the Far East. Japanese planners estimated they would need approximately 50 divisions, significant air support, and, crucially, a guarantee that the Red Army in the east had been stripped to reinforce the German front. Throughout July and August 1941, the Kwantung Army conducted massive mobilization exercises, calling up reserves and positioning forces along the Soviet border. Soviet intelligence, ever vigilant, detected this buildup immediately. Stalin, even while facing existential threat from Germany, refused to completely denude his eastern defenses. He maintained approximately 30 divisions in the Far East, a force sufficient to give any Japanese planner pause. But the critical factor was not just Soviet defensive strength. It was the emerging realization within Japanese strategic circles that the window of opportunity, if it had ever truly existed, was rapidly closing. By late summer 1941, it became clear that while the Soviets had suffered catastrophic losses, they had not collapsed. The Red Army continued to resist, trading space for time. And Soviet industrial capacity, much of it relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, continued to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. More importantly, Japanese intelligence began receiving reports that contradicted their initial assessments. The Soviets were not pulling every last division from the east. They maintained a credible defensive force, and any Japanese invasion would face immediate, organized resistance, not a power vacuum. Simultaneously, Japan's strategic attention was being pulled inexorably southward. The empire's fundamental weakness was its lack of natural resources, particularly oil. The war in China, which had been raging since 1937, was consuming vast quantities of petroleum, and Japan's domestic production covered only a fraction of its needs. The United States, Japan's primary oil supplier, had imposed increasingly severe economic sanctions in response to Japanese aggression in China. By the summer of 1941, these sanctions had evolved into a full oil embargo, coordinated with Britain and the Dutch East Indies. Japan's oil reserves were being depleted at an alarming rate. Without access to new sources of petroleum, the Japanese military machine would grind to a halt within months, perhaps a year at most. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, possessed abundant oil fields. British Malaya had rubber and tin. French Indochina offered rice and strategic position. These territories, defended by colonial forces that appeared far weaker than the Red Army, represented an immediately attainable solution to Japan's resource crisis. The debate within Japanese leadership throughout the summer and fall of 1941 was intense and consequential. The army, particularly the Kwantung Army faction, favored the northern option, attacking the Soviet Union in coordination with Germany. They argued that eliminating the Soviet threat would secure Japan's continental position, provide access to Siberian resources, and fulfill Japan's destiny as the dominant Asian power. The Navy, however, advocated forcefully for the southern option. Naval planners argued that oil was the immediate crisis, that the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia were more valuable than the frozen wastes of Siberia, and that the United States, not the Soviet Union, was Japan's ultimate rival for Pacific dominance. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, commander of the Combined Fleet, warned that if Japan was going to fight America, it needed to strike first, strike hard, and seize the resources necessary for a prolonged conflict before American industrial might could be fully mobilized. The decision was effectively made at the Imperial Conference of September 6, 1941. Emperor Hirohito presided over a meeting of Japan's top civilian and military leaders, where the consensus emerged that Japan would pursue the Southern strategy. The attack on the Soviet Union was postponed indefinitely, contingent on a complete Soviet collapse that never materialized. Instead, Japan would seize the resource zones of Southeast Asia, and if that meant war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, so be it. The logic was coldly pragmatic. Japan needed oil to survive, the Dutch East Indies had oil, and the colonial powers appeared vulnerable. The Soviet Union, by contrast, offered uncertain gains at tremendous cost against an enemy that had already proven its capacity to inflict devastating casualties on Japanese forces. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, and the Pacific War began. Within months, Japan had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma, creating a vast empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. The gamble appeared to have paid off. Japan had secured the resources it needed, and the colonial powers had collapsed faster than even optimistic Japanese planners had predicted. But the decision to go south rather than north had profound consequences that would only become apparent as the war progressed. By choosing to attack the United States rather than the Soviet Union, Japan had made an enemy of the world's largest industrial power while leaving the Soviet Union free to concentrate entirely on Germany. The strategic implications for the Soviet Union were immense. Throughout 1941, Stalin had maintained substantial forces in the Far East, specifically because he could not be certain of Japanese intentions. Soviet intelligence, particularly the spy Richard Sorhe operating in Tokyo, provided crucial information about Japanese strategic debates. In October 1941, Sorge sent a message to Moscow confirming that Japan had decided to strike south, not north, and that the Soviet Far East was not under immediate threat. This intelligence allowed Stalin to make one of the most consequential decisions of the war. He began transferring divisions from the Far East to the Moscow front. In late 1941 and early 1942, approximately 15 divisions, battle-hardened and fully equipped for winter warfare, were moved westward via the Trans-Siberian Railway. These forces, many of them Siberian rifle divisions accustomed to extreme cold, arrived just as the German offensive toward Moscow was reaching its culmination point. The Soviet counteroffensive that began in December 1941 drove German forces back from Moscow and demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. Among the units that participated in this counteroffensive were the very divisions that had been released from the Far East because Japan had chosen to attack Pearl Harbor instead of Vladivostok. It is not an exaggeration to say that Japan's decision to go south rather than north contributed directly to Germany's failure to capture Moscow and potentially to the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. Had Japan attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin would have faced the nightmare scenario of a genuine two-front war. Soviet divisions would have been pinned in the east, unable to reinforce the desperate defense of Moscow. Whether this would have changed the ultimate outcome of the war is a matter of historical speculation, but it certainly would have prolonged the conflict and increased Soviet casualties beyond even the staggering numbers actually suffered. From Japan's perspective, the decision to avoid war with the Soviet Union appeared strategically sound in 1941 and 1942, but it created a long-term vulnerability that would prove fatal. By 1945, with Germany defeated and the European War concluded, the Soviet Union was free to turn its full attention eastward. Stalin had never forgotten Japanese aggression in 1938 and 1939, and he had territorial ambitions in East Asia that had been temporarily shelved but never abandoned. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. In exchange for territorial concessions, including the southern half of Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, and recognition of Soviet interests in Manchuria and Korea. The Western Allies, particularly the United States, were eager for Soviet participation, believing it would hasten Japan's surrender and reduce American casualties in the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands. On August 9, 1945, exactly 3 months after Germany's surrender, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive into Manchuria. The operation, involving over 1.5 million Soviet troops, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and orchestrated across a front stretching thousands of miles, was a demonstration of Soviet military power at its apex. The Kwantung Army, which had once been Japan's most formidable force, had been systematically stripped of its best units to defend the home islands and the Pacific perimeters. What remained in Manchuria was a hollow shell, poorly equipped and incapable of stopping the Soviet onslaught. Within days, Soviet forces had penetrated deep into Manchuria, overwhelming Japanese defenses and racing toward strategic objectives. The campaign lasted less than 3 weeks, but it resulted in the complete destruction of Japanese forces in Manchuria, the occupation of the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin, and the Soviet positioning in Korea that would lead directly to the peninsula's division and the Korean War 5 years later. The speed and totality of the Soviet victory in August 1945 vindicated Stalin's decision to wait rather than engage Japan earlier in the war. By entering the conflict only at the very end, the Soviet Union gained all the territorial and strategic benefits it had sought, at minimal cost in Soviet lives, and without having diverted resources from the critical struggle against Germany. For Japan, the Soviet invasion was the final catastrophe in a series of catastrophes. Coming just days after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, and with Nagasaki's bombing occurring on the same day as the Soviet declaration of war, the entry of the Soviet Union into the Pacific War eliminated any remaining hope that Japan could negotiate a conditional surrender or use the Soviets as mediators with the Western Allies. The Japanese government surrendered on August 15, 1945, citing both the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion as factors that made continued resistance impossible. The question of why Japan did not attack the Soviet Union during World War II thus resolves into a complex interplay of military realism, resource desperation, and strategic miscalculation. Japan wanted to attack, had plans to attack, and came close to attacking in the summer of 1941. But the memory of Khalkhin Gol, the recognition that the Red Army had not collapsed despite German advances, the immediate crisis of oil shortages, and the apparent vulnerability of Southeast Asian colonial territories all combined to pull Japanese strategy southward rather than northward. The decision was rational, given the information available at the time and the constraints Japan faced. But it was also a decision that sealed Japan's fate, because it meant making an enemy of the United States while leaving the Soviet Union intact and ultimately free to deliver the final blow in 1945. The legacy of this decision extends far beyond World War II itself. The Soviet occupation of the Kuril Islands remains a point of contention between Russia and Japan to this day, with no formal peace treaty ever signed between the two nations. The Soviet positioning in Manchuria and Korea in August 1945 created the conditions for communist victory in the Chinese Civil War and the division of Korea, conflicts whose consequences still shape East Asian geopolitics. The decision not to attack the Soviet Union in 1941, while seemingly a tactical choice about resource allocation and strategic priority, ultimately contributed to the Cold War architecture of East Asia, the division of the Korean Peninsula, and the rise of Communist China. History turns on such decisions, moments when leaders choose one path over another, often for reasons that seem compelling in the moment, but whose full consequences only become clear decades later. Japan's choice to strike south rather than north in 1941 was one such moment, A decision that changed the course of the war, the shape of the peace, and the world we inhabit today.